The Ghost Army was never supposed to exist. In the winter of 1944, along the Western Front in Europe, a U.S. Army unit moved closer to German positions than most infantry formations ever dared. They carried no heavy artillery, no armored battalions, no numerical superiority. What they brought instead were inflatable tanks, fake artillery, sound recordings blasted through massive speakers, and radio traffic that mimicked entire divisions that were not there. And somehow, it worked. German commanders redeployed forces. German artillery fired at empty ground. Entire sectors of the front reacted to an army that did not exist. Why did a professional, battle-hardened military respond to rubber and noise as if it were steel and firepower? Why was this deception executed not in the safety of the rear, but within a few hundred meters of enemy lines? And why did the U.S. Army trust a handful of artists, engineers, and sound technicians with decisions that could collapse real operations if exposed? Because the Ghost Army was not a trick. It was a strategic gamble against how an enemy thinks under pressure. And that gamble came terrifyingly close to failure. To understand why it succeeded, we first have to understand why it should never have been attempted. The Ghost Army, officially the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, poses a problem that does not fit neatly into military history. This is not a story about clever camouflage. It is not a story about morale-building theatrics. And it is not simply an appendix to larger deception efforts like Operation Fortitude. The core strategic question of this episode is far more uncomfortable. Can perception itself be weaponized at the tactical level, close enough that failure means immediate annihilation, and still be controlled? Most military deception operates at a distance. It buys ambiguity. It hides intent. The Ghost Army did something fundamentally different. It replaced physical mass with cognitive mass. It did not obscure real units, it stood in for them. This meant the unit was not just supporting combat operations. It was temporarily substituting for real combat power. If the deception failed, there would be no fallback. No gradual correction. No time to recover. Rubber tanks would not stop shells. Sound effects would not slow infantry. Radio traffic would not save men once German patrols crossed the line. And yet senior commanders approved these missions. Not once, but repeatedly. Across France. Across Belgium. And finally, at the Rhine. This is why the Ghost Army qualifies as a truly unorthodox strategy. Not because it was clever, but because it deliberately violated the safety assumptions that normally govern deception warfare. To see how desperate and constrained this decision environment was, we have to map the battlefield that made normal solutions impossible. And that map explains why orthodoxy failed before the Ghost Army ever appeared. The Ghost Army did not emerge from creative ambition. It emerged from constraint. By late 1944, the Western Front had entered a phase where Allied superiority no longer translated cleanly into freedom of action. Normandy was behind them. Paris was liberated. But momentum had slowed. The problem was not victory. The problem was how to continue advancing without paying an unacceptable price. The Allied side, power with friction. On paper, the Allies held overwhelming advantages. They had air dominance. They had industrial depth. They had numerical superiority in men and material. But those advantages were unevenly usable. Every advance eastward stretched supply lines. Fuel shortages dictated tempo. Bridges became choke points. Rivers, especially in winter, turned movement into exposure. The Rhine was not just a geographic obstacle. It was a psychological one. Crossing it meant entering the German heartland. It meant committing forces to narrow, predictable corridors under direct observation. And it meant doing so while the enemy still retained the ability to concentrate fire faster than Allied forces could replace losses. Every successful crossing required time. Every hour required protection. And protection required either firepower or misdirection. The German side, weakness with teeth. German forces in late 1944 were degraded, but not blind. They lacked fuel. They lacked reserves. They lacked strategic initiative. What they still possessed was a defensive mindset shaped by years of attritional warfare. German command culture emphasized early detection, rapid interpretation, Concentrated response. They did not need to win everywhere. They needed to react correctly at the decisive point. This created a dangerous asymmetry. The Allies needed to hide where they were going. The Germans only needed to identify where they might be going and reinforce that possibility. This made perception disproportionately powerful. The battlefield was no longer just terrain. Traditional military maps focus on rivers, roads, elevations. But by 1944, another layer mattered just as much. The intelligence map. Where did German reconnaissance expect pressure? What signals were German analysts trained to trust? Which patterns triggered reinforcement? German commanders did not respond to isolated observations. They responded to coherence. Tank sightings plus radio chatter. Construction noise plus troop movements. Supply activity plus command signals. When those elements aligned, the response followed. And that coherence could be manufactured. Time, the most expensive resource. Allied planners faced a brutal equation. Every real crossing operation required engineers working in exposed conditions, large troop concentrations, predictable logistical signatures, which meant every crossing advertised itself. Suppressing German reaction required either overwhelming firepower or distraction. Firepower cost lives. Distraction cost risk. And distraction had limits. Once used, deception lost value. Patterns could be learned. Trust could be withdrawn. This forced Allied command into an uncomfortable corner. They needed deception. But they needed deception that did not look like deception. Why conventional options failed? A normal solution would have been straightforward. Mass armor. Heavy bombardment. Rapid exploitation. But this assumed conditions that did not exist. Fuel shortages limited armor mobility. Weather reduced air support reliability. German defenses were layered, prepared, and reactive. Each conventional solution increased predictability. Predictability reduced surprise. Reduced surprise increased casualties. The map itself was hostile to orthodoxy. The psychological geography. Beyond physical terrain lay something more fragile. Expectation. German command expected certain behaviors from Allied forces. Real units leave real footprints. Large formations generate sustained radio traffic. Major crossings require visible buildup. They trusted these assumptions because they had been reliable. No major Western army had ever attempted to substitute illusion for mass at this scale, this close to contact. This expectation gap created a narrow window. A space where something implausible could slip through precisely because it was implausible. The constraint that created the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army was not designed to win battles. It was designed to stand in for battles that could not yet be fought. Its purpose was to draw attention without engaging. Signal strength without possessing it. Delay reaction without triggering investigation. This required operating close enough to hooking German attention, but not close enough to invite verification. That distance was razor thin. Hundreds of meters. Not kilometers. Not theoretical space. Real space, measured in footsteps and patrol routes. The risk map. At this distance, the risks multiplied. A German patrol pushes slightly further. A reconnaissance aircraft flies lower. An artillery observer adjusts coordinates. Any one of these collapses the illusion. And once collapsed, there is no reset. There is only exposure. The Ghost Army did not exist in a safe vacuum of planning rooms. It existed inside this compressed, hostile decision environment. Which raises the central tension of the entire operation. If the battlefield made conventional solutions untenable, and deception was the only remaining lever, then how do you convince a military institution to adopt a strategy that looks irrational, dangerous, and professionally heretical? Because ideas do not move armies. Decisions do. And decisions require breaking doctrine, deliberately. That break is where the real story begins. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It codifies what has worked often enough to be trusted again. It narrows options. It protects commanders from catastrophic improvisation. By 1944, Allied doctrine on the Western Front was clear, refined, and proven. And under the conditions of late 1944, it was also increasingly inadequate. What correct strategy looked like? The orthodox solution to German defensive positions followed a familiar logic. First, mass forces. Second, suppress with firepower. Third, breach decisively. Fourth, exploit before the enemy reorganizes. This doctrine assumed three things. That mass could be assembled without decisive interference. That firepower could be applied faster than the enemy could adapt. That losses, while painful, would remain acceptable. In Normandy, this logic held. By late 1944, it no longer did. Why doctrine became a liability? Every doctrinal move carried a signature. Massing troops meant visible buildup. Visible buildup meant reconnaissance detection. Detection meant preemptive German response. The Germans did not need to stop every advance. They needed to slow it. And slowing the Allies meant forcing them into predictable choices. Doctrinal correctness made Allied intentions legible. Legibility invited resistance. Resistance increased casualties. The casualty trap. By this stage of the war, Allied leadership was no longer fighting only Germany. They were fighting arithmetic. Every crossing, every assault, every acceptable loss accumulated. Doctrine did not account for cumulative psychological and political fatigue. It assumed that superior resources could absorb friction indefinitely. They could not. The closer the Allies moved toward Germany, the higher the cost per mile advanced. Doctrine offered victory. It did not offer efficiency. The problem with firepower. Firepower was the obvious answer. More artillery. More bombing. More suppression. But firepower solved only part of the problem. It destroyed positions. It did not control reaction. German forces adapted by dispersing. By delaying. By reinforcing threatened sectors selectively. Firepower created noise. It did not create confusion. Why deception was not in the manual? Deception existed in doctrine, but only in controlled, distant forms. Feints. False preparations. Operational level misdirection. What doctrine explicitly avoided was tactical substitution. No serious military text advocated replacing real combat units with illusions in contact zones. The reason was simple. Deception failed catastrophically when tested too closely. And doctrine was designed to prevent catastrophic failure. The professional risk. For a commander, doctrine offered protection. If a doctrinal plan failed, responsibility diffused upward and outward. If an unorthodox plan failed, responsibility concentrated. The ghost army concept violated this professional safety net. It asked commanders to approve missions that could not be stress-tested beforehand. Relied on enemy interpretation. Had no graceful failure mode. This made the idea radioactive inside conventional planning culture. The hidden assumption doctrine never questioned. Doctrine rested on a silent belief. That combat power must be physically present to influence enemy behavior. This assumption was rarely stated, because it was rarely challenged. The ghost army challenged it directly. Not by denying the value of force, but by asking whether force always had to be there to be effective. The doctrinal dead end. By late 1944, Allied planners faced a narrowing corridor of acceptable options. They could advance slowly and bleed. Advance quickly and bleed more. Or pause and concede initiative. None of these options addressed the core issue. German reactions were faster than Allied deployments. Doctrine had no answer for that asymmetry. Where orthodoxy broke, the ghost army emerged not as an alternative to doctrine, but as a response to its failure. Doctrine could win battles. It could not always win time. And time had become the decisive currency. What was needed was not more force. What was needed was a way to redirect enemy force without engaging it. Doctrine did not teach how to do that. The moment of heresy. Approving the ghost army meant accepting 3 violations of doctrinal faith. That deception could substitute for mass. That proximity increased effectiveness rather than risk. that enemy cognition was a manipulable terrain. None of these beliefs were safe. All of them were necessary. The question was no longer whether doctrine was correct. The question was whether correctness was still survivable. Because if Allied command continued to fight the war doctrine told them they were fighting, they would win slowly. And the cost of slow victory was becoming politically and morally intolerable. Something had to break. And it was not going to be the enemy first. Unorthodox strategies do not begin as bold declarations. They begin as quiet refusals. The Ghost Army did not appear because someone wanted to be clever. It appeared because a series of planners, engineers, and commanders reached the same private conclusion. If we keep solving this problem the right way, we will keep paying the wrong price. The idea that did not belong. The core concept was not new. Camouflage had existed for centuries. Feints were as old as warfare itself. False signals were common in intelligence operations. What was new was the scale and the proximity. The proposal was not to mislead from afar. It was to stand in for real formations. This immediately triggered resistance. Not moral resistance. Professional resistance. The idea did not fail because it was unthinkable. It failed because it was unclassifiable. It did not fit infantry doctrine. It did not fit intelligence doctrine. It did not fit engineering doctrine. And anything that fits nowhere is dangerous to approve. Who pushed, and who hesitated? The push for tactical deception came from specialists who understood perception better than firepower. Signal officers who understood how radio traffic shaped enemy assumptions. Engineers who knew how terrain was read, not just occupied. Artists and designers who understood how scale, repetition, and silhouette tricked the human eye. They were not asking to replace combat units permanently. They were asking to borrow credibility temporarily. This distinction mattered. Senior commanders did not reject the idea outright. They stalled. They asked for limits. They demanded containment. They insisted on reversibility. None of those conditions truly applied. Once deployed, the Ghost Army could not be half believed. The core strategic assumption. Every risky plan rests on assumptions. The Ghost Army rested on three. First, that German intelligence prioritized pattern consistency over direct verification. If multiple signals aligned, German commanders would act before checking too closely. Second, that German defensive doctrine rewarded early reaction more than cautious delay. This meant false positives were safer than missed threats. Third, that time pressure distorted judgment. Under pressure, commanders simplified. They did not investigate anomalies. They resolved them. If these assumptions held, deception could work. If even one failed, the entire structure collapsed. Why this was a cognitive attack? This strategy did not target German units. It targeted German decision cycles. The goal was not to confuse everyone. It was to confuse the right people at the right moment. Specifically, reconnaissance officers interpreting incomplete data. Staff officers correlating signals under time constraints. Commanders forced to act before uncertainty resolved. The Ghost Army was designed to inject certainty, false certainty, into that process. Not chaos. Certainty is more dangerous than confusion. Confusion delays. Certainty misdirects. The internal objection no one could eliminate. There was one objection that could not be argued away. What if they check? A patrol crosses further than expected. A reconnaissance unit probes aggressively. A captured soldier reveals the illusion. This was not a hypothetical risk. It was inevitable, eventually. The Ghost Army could not survive prolonged scrutiny. Which meant every mission had to be temporary, precise, and timed. This placed enormous pressure on coordination. The deception had to end before it was discovered. That margin was measured in hours, not days. Why approval was still granted? The decision to proceed was not born of confidence. It was born of calculation. Commanders compared two curves. The predictable casualty curve of orthodox assault. And the unpredictable risk curve of deception. One promised steady loss. The other promised sudden failure. They chose the curve that might be shorter. This was not optimism. It was triage. Authority without visibility. One of the most dangerous aspects of the Ghost Army was oversight. Success would be invisible. Failure would be immediate. There would be no dramatic battlefield victory to point to. Only absence. An absence of German fire where it was expected. An absence of resistance where it was planned. This meant commanders had to approve operations they could not directly observe. They would know it worked only because nothing happened. This inverted traditional command validation. The final constraint. Even after approval, the plan remained fragile. The Ghost Army could not be used everywhere. It could not be used repeatedly in the same way. And it could not be exposed. Its power depended on novelty. Once the enemy adjusted, the window closed. This made every deployment a calculated burn of a finite resource. Deception was not renewable. It was consumable. The decision that changed the rules. By authorizing the Ghost Army, Allied command accepted a dangerous truth. That control over enemy perception could, under the right conditions, temporarily replace physical dominance. This did not make firepower obsolete. It made it optional, briefly. That option was all they needed. But deciding was the easy part. Executing it, at the edge of enemy lines, under live observation, with no safety margin, was where theory met consequence. And consequence did not care about intentions. A deception strategy lives or dies at the moment it leaves paper. For the Ghost Army, execution was not about performance. It was about synchronization under threat. Nothing they did could look improvised. Nothing they did could look careful. Everything had to look routine. That was the paradox. Turning illusion into presence. The Ghost Army operated through substitution. They did not hide real units. They temporarily replaced them. This meant every element of a real formation had to be represented. Visual mass. Auditory mass. Electromagnetic mass. If any one of these was missing, the illusion collapsed. Inflatable tanks alone were not enough. Sound alone was suspicious. Radio traffic without physical cues was meaningless. The system worked only when all three aligned. Visual mechanics, scale without substance. The visual layer was the most visible, and the most fragile. Inflatable tanks and artillery were deployed with obsessive attention to spacing and orientation. They were not clustered randomly. They followed doctrinal patterns. Vehicles faced plausible directions. Gun barrels aligned with likely fields of fire. Tracks were dragged into place to simulate movement. Even camps were staged. Tents appeared in believable densities. Paths formed naturally between positions. Equipment was placed where soldiers would realistically leave it. This was not camouflage. It was behavioral mimicry. Any reconnaissance observer could be fooled for minutes. The goal was to ensure they were fooled long enough. Sonic mechanics, the invisible anchor. Sound carried farther than sight. The Ghost Army sound units broadcast recordings of real armored formations, engines, track noise, shouted commands, metal impacts. These were not loops played carelessly. They were sequenced. The audio evolved over time to suggest activity. Arrival. Preparation. Idle periods. Movement. Silence was as important as noise. Too much sound implied panic or incompetence. Too little invited investigation. The soundscape had to match what doctrine expected to hear. This was one of the most dangerous layers. Sound attracted attention. And attention invited probing. Radio mechanics, manufacturing authority. Radio deception was the backbone. Without it, everything else looked like theater. Ghost Army operators mimicked the communication style of specific divisions. Not just call signs. Not just frequencies. But habits. Message length. Pacing. Error patterns. Even operator personalities. German signals intelligence was trained to recognize these subtleties. Which meant impersonation had to be flawless. A single inconsistency could unravel the narrative. Radio deception did not overwhelm German listeners. It reassured them. It told them what they already expected to hear. Logistics, the weight of lightness. Illusions still require supply. Inflatable equipment had to be transported, maintained, concealed, and redeployed. Sound equipment was heavy. Generators needed fuel. Radio teams required security. Every movement risked exposure. And every additional vehicle created real logistical signatures that could contradict the illusion. This forced constant trade-offs. Do you move equipment during daylight for speed, or at night for concealment? Do you maintain sound broadcasts, or risk mechanical failure by pushing generators too hard? Logistics was not supporting deception. Logistics was constraining it. The timing window. Every Ghost Army mission operated inside a shrinking window. The illusion had to appear quickly, persist convincingly, disappear cleanly. Lingering was deadly. The longer the deception remained in place, the higher the probability of verification. This meant withdrawal was as dangerous as deployment. Removing inflatable tanks without leaving traces. Silencing sound units without creating suspicion. Ending radio traffic in ways that suggested redeployment, not disappearance. The exit had to tell a story. Failure point 1, curiosity. The most dangerous enemy reaction was not attack. It was curiosity. A cautious probe. A patrol testing the perimeter. An artillery ranging shot. These actions did not commit German forces, but they threatened to reveal the truth. The Ghost Army had limited responses. They could not escalate. They could not engage meaningfully. They could only delay. Delay was survival. Failure point 2, overperformance. Success carried its own risk. If the illusion was too convincing, it attracted higher-level scrutiny. More reconnaissance. More signal monitoring. More aggressive confirmation. This forced planners to calibrate effectiveness carefully. The goal was not to dominate attention. It was to divert it. Failure point 3, internal friction. The Ghost Army never operated alone. Real units depended on them. This created coordination risks. If a real unit moved too early, it contradicted the illusion. If it moved too late, the deception overstayed. Timing errors could expose both. This required trust. Trust between units that did not fully understand each other's constraints. And trust was not guaranteed. The micro-twists. Several operations came close to collapse. Weather interfered with sound propagation. Equipment malfunctioned under pressure. German artillery occasionally fired into empty positions, dangerously close. Each incident tested the core assumption. Would the Germans escalate, or accept what they believed they were seeing? They usually accepted it. But usually was not certainty. It was risk deferred. Why execution was the real strategy. The Ghost Army did not win because of technology. It won because of discipline. Every operator understood that improvisation was lethal. Every mistake compounded across layers. This was not creative chaos. It was controlled constraint. The illusion held because nothing deviated. But control is brittle. And brittleness under enemy pressure leads to cracks. Which brings us to the final unknown in every Ghost Army operation. Not what they did, but how the enemy interpreted it. Because deception does not end with execution. It ends with reaction. And reaction is where control finally shifts hands. The Ghost Army never needed the Germans to be fooled forever. It only needed them to be fooled at the wrong moment. Enemy reaction was the final, uncontrollable variable, and paradoxically, the most predictable one. What the Germans actually saw. German commanders did not encounter a single illusion. They encountered convergence. Visual sightings of armor silhouettes. Sound reports of engines and troop movement. Radio intercepts consistent with known Allied units. Each signal, taken alone, was questionable. Taken together, they formed a coherent picture. And coherence is what staff officers trust. Not truth. The tyranny of pattern recognition. German military intelligence in 1944 was not naive. It was disciplined, structured, and trained to correlate inputs quickly. That training became a vulnerability. Signals intelligence was weighted heavily because it had proven reliable earlier in the war. Radio traffic, in particular, was treated as a high-confidence indicator of unit presence. The Ghost Army exploited this hierarchy. They did not introduce new patterns. They replicated familiar ones. Which meant German analysts were not solving a puzzle. They were confirming expectations. Why verification failed? Under ideal conditions, illusions invite verification. Under wartime pressure, verification costs time. Time was the one resource German commanders lacked. By late 1944, German defensive doctrine emphasized early reaction. Reinforce first. Confirm later. This bias mattered. A false negative, ignoring a real threat, was catastrophic. A false positive, reinforcing a phantom, was inconvenient. The Ghost Army lived inside that asymmetry. The cognitive compression effect. As pressure increased, German command decisions compressed. Multiple possibilities collapsed into a single, most likely, interpretation. This was not irrational. It was efficient. Efficiency, under deception, becomes exploitable. The Ghost Army did not overwhelm German cognition. It simplified it. The role of hierarchy. German command structure further amplified the problem. Lower-level officers reported observations. Mid-level staff synthesized them. Senior commanders made decisions under urgency. Each layer reduced ambiguity. By the time information reached the top, doubt had been filtered out. What remained was a clean narrative. Clean narratives are dangerous. Where the reaction went wrong. The critical error was not belief. It was commitment. German commanders committed forces based on incomplete certainty. They moved reserves. They adjusted artillery coverage. They reoriented defensive priorities. Each move reinforced the illusion. Once committed, reversing course became costly. No commander wanted to admit that resources had been redirected toward nothing. The point of no return. Every Ghost Army operation sought the same outcome. Force a reaction large enough that it could not be quietly undone. Once German forces redeployed, the deception no longer needed to persist. Reality could reassert itself elsewhere. By the time doubts emerged, the window had closed. The damage was done. Why skepticism didn't save them? Some German officers likely suspected deception. But suspicion without proof is inert. Raising alarms required evidence. Evidence required investigation. Investigation required resources. Resources were already committed. The system discouraged hesitation. The enemy's blind spot. The deepest miscalculation was not tactical. It was conceptual. German command did not believe the Allies would risk deception this close to contact. They assumed that no professional army would substitute illusion for force at this range. That deception belonged to preparation, not execution. This assumption protected the Ghost Army. The Germans were not unobservant. They were orthodox. The irony of experience. Years of combat had taught German commanders to recognize Allied patterns. That experience made them vulnerable. The Ghost Army did not invent new signals. It weaponized old ones. Experience became inertia. When the illusion ended. In most cases, the illusion did not collapse under enemy fire. It expired on schedule. The Ghost Army withdrew. Radio traffic shifted. Sound ceased. German forces later discovered emptiness. By then, it no longer mattered. The reaction had already shaped the battlefield. The uncomfortable conclusion. The Ghost Army did not defeat German forces. It defeated German decision-making under pressure. And that raises an unsettling question. If a professional military could be redirected so decisively by signals it trusted, how much of warfare is determined not by strength, but by interpretation? And if interpretation can be manipulated, then deception is not an accessory to combat. It is a form of combat, with consequences that extend beyond the battlefield. Measured purely by battlefield metrics, the Ghost Army left little behind. No captured cities. No shattered divisions. No dramatic photographs of surrender. Its success was defined by what did not happen. And that makes its cost harder to see, but no less real. What the strategy actually bought. The immediate payoff was time. Time for real units to move without being targeted. Time for engineers to work without sustained fire. Time for commanders to shift forces without advertising intent. In several operations, German artillery and reserves were aimed at empty ground while real crossings occurred elsewhere. This did not win the war. It reduced friction at decisive moments. And friction, in late 1944, was killing men faster than German bullets. The Ghost Army functioned as a temporary replacement for mass. It allowed Allied commanders to appear strong where they were weak, and absent where they were strong. That asymmetry mattered. The human cost hidden inside success. The soldiers of the Ghost Army operated under a unique form of exposure. They were placed close to enemy lines. They were lightly armed. And they were expected to remain visible. Their survival depended entirely on enemy belief. If that belief cracked, there was no escalation path. No reinforcement surge. No defensive fallback. They would not be overrun slowly. They would be erased quickly. This created a psychological burden unlike conventional combat. They were not waiting for contact. They were waiting for discovery. Every sound of movement. Every unexpected flare. Every pause in enemy response raised the same question. Are we still invisible, or have we just not been tested yet? The cost of constant control. Unlike combat units, the Ghost Army could not adapt freely. Improvisation was dangerous. Creativity was constrained. Routine was survival. Operators had to suppress instinct. They could not respond emotionally to threat. They could not fix anomalies aggressively. Everything had to remain consistent with the illusion. That level of self-discipline is exhausting. And mistakes were cumulative. One error did not kill the plan. But it weakened trust. And once trust eroded, collapse followed fast. The logistical price of illusion. Illusions are not light. Inflatable equipment required transport, maintenance, concealment. Sound systems required power, fuel, and protection. Radio operations demanded constant attention and coordination. These resources competed with real combat needs. Every generator allocated to deception was not allocated elsewhere. Every truck used to move rubber armor was not carrying ammunition. The Ghost Army was efficient, but not free. It consumed logistical bandwidth that could not be easily replaced. Political and institutional cost. Perhaps the most significant cost was institutional. Success was deliberately invisible. There were no medals tied to decisive engagements. No after-action reports celebrating victories. For decades, the Ghost Army's contributions remained classified. The unit saved lives, but could not claim it. This had consequences. Careers were built elsewhere. Lessons were quietly absorbed but not publicly debated. Deception remained marginal in post-war doctrine. The institution learned, but did not teach. The cost of non-repeatability. The Ghost Army worked because it was novel. Once revealed, it could not be used again in the same way. This made it a consumable strategy. Each mission burned credibility. Each success narrowed future options. Unlike firepower, deception does not scale indefinitely. It degrades with exposure. That makes it powerful and fragile. The counterfactual, if it had failed. Failure would not have looked dramatic. There would have been no single moment of revelation. Just a patrol pushing too far. A reconnaissance unit observing too closely. An artillery correction landing accurately. Then escalation. The Ghost Army could not absorb pressure. Failure would have meant casualties disproportionate to the unit's size and disproportionate to its visibility. And worse, it would have poisoned future deception efforts. One exposed illusion could have closed the door on unorthodox strategies for the remainder of the war. That risk was understood. And accepted. The ethical cost. Deception saves lives by redirecting violence. But it does so by manipulating belief. The Ghost Army forced German commanders to commit soldiers to places where no battle existed. Those soldiers were not spared. They were displaced. Some were killed elsewhere as a result. This is not moral arithmetic. It is strategic trade-off. And trade-offs do not disappear because intentions were good. The final accounting. The Ghost Army did not win battles. It altered conditions under which battles were fought. It replaced brute force with cognitive leverage, briefly. That leverage came at the cost of certainty, recognition, and safety. Its operators lived inside a margin where success was silent and failure was final. That is the true price of unorthodox warfare. And it leaves us with a deeper question than whether the strategy worked. What does it mean when belief becomes more decisive than firepower? The Ghost Army is often remembered for its tools. Inflatable tanks. Sound effects. Fake radio traffic. That memory is misleading. Because tools are replaceable. Principles are not. What made this strategy dangerous and powerful was not what it used, but what it assumed about war itself. Principle 1. War is fought inside decision systems, not just battlefields. Traditional military thinking treats terrain as physical space. The Ghost Army treated terrain as cognitive space. They understood that modern warfare is mediated through systems. Reconnaissance pipelines. Intelligence analysis cells. Command hierarchies under time pressure. Enemy forces do not react to reality. They react to interpreted reality. The Ghost Army did not attempt to alter German strength. It altered German inputs. Once those inputs entered the decision system, the outcome followed automatically. This is not manipulation at the tactical edge. It is systems warfare. Principle 2. Certainty is more dangerous than confusion. Most deception aims to confuse. The Ghost Army aimed to convince. Confusion slows decisions. Certainty accelerates them in the wrong direction. By presenting a coherent, familiar pattern, the Ghost Army reduced doubt. German commanders did not feel uncertain. They felt informed. That is why they acted. This reverses a common misconception. The most effective deception does not create chaos. It creates clarity built on false premises. Principle 3. Proximity multiplies effect and risk. Deception is usually safer at distance. The Ghost Army inverted this logic. By operating close to enemy lines, they increased plausibility. Signals matched expectations because they occurred where signals were expected. This proximity amplified effectiveness, but eliminated safety margins. There was no buffer. No graceful failure. This is the core trade-off of unorthodox warfare. The closer you get to the truth, the more powerful the lie becomes, and the more lethal its exposure. Principle 4. Doctrine protects institutions, not outcomes. Doctrine exists to prevent disaster. But it also prevents adaptation. The Ghost Army succeeded because it accepted institutional risk in exchange for operational gain. Commanders authorized actions that could not be justified through precedent. They chose outcome optimization over doctrinal protection. This does not mean doctrine is wrong. It means doctrine has a cost. And sometimes the cost exceeds the risk of deviation. Principle 5. Deception is a consumable resource. Firepower can be replenished. Personnel can be replaced. Equipment can be rebuilt. Credibility cannot. The Ghost Army worked because the enemy had not seen it before. Each successful operation reduced future viability. This makes deception fundamentally different from kinetic power. It must be timed. It must be limited. And it must be abandoned before it becomes predictable. Unorthodox strategies rarely age well. They work once, decisively, or not at all. Principle 6. The most valuable asset was discipline, not creativity. The Ghost Army is often romanticized as artistic ingenuity. That is inaccurate. Creativity built the tools. Discipline kept them alive. Operators followed scripts precisely. They resisted improvisation. They maintained consistency under stress. This was not theatrical freedom. It was controlled repetition. The lesson is uncomfortable. Unorthodox warfare does not reward imagination. It rewards restraint. Principle 7. Success can be strategically invisible. The Ghost Army achieved its objectives by preventing events. No battles fought. No breakthroughs recorded. No dramatic collapses. This creates a structural bias in how history remembers war. Visible victories dominate narratives. Invisible successes fade. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. Some of the most consequential strategic actions leave no ruins behind. Only altered timelines. What this strategy was really about. At its core, the Ghost Army was not about deception. It was about leveraging enemy predictability. German commanders were not foolish. They were rational, trained, and pressured. Their predictability was a product of professionalism. The Ghost Army did not exploit weakness. It exploited competence operating under constraint. This is the most unsettling lesson of all. The more structured a system becomes, the more it can be manipulated at the seams. Can this be repeated? Yes, but not in the same form. Modern warfare has shifted from physical signals to digital ones. From sound to data. From silhouettes to metadata. From radio traffic to algorithmic patterns. But the principle remains. Whoever controls the inputs controls the reaction. The Ghost Army was an early demonstration of that reality. Not a relic. A prototype. The final question. The Ghost Army forces us to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. If belief can be weaponized. If perception can substitute for power. If decisions can be redirected without engagement. Then the decisive battlefield is no longer where soldiers stand. It is where assumptions live. And those assumptions are fragile. Easier to shape than we like to admit. The Ghost Army did not defeat Germany. It did not break enemy lines. It did not force surrender. What it did was quieter and more unsettling. It proved that in modern war, control over interpretation can temporarily outweigh control over terrain. This was not a victory of clever props over steel. It was a victory of structured illusion over structured reasoning. The German command system did exactly what it was designed to do. It detected patterns. It correlated signals. It acted decisively. That competence was the opening. The Ghost Army did not exploit chaos. It exploited order. And that is why this strategy remains uncomfortable to analyze. Because it suggests that the more professional, rational, and disciplined a military becomes, the more predictable its decision-making edges can be shaped, subtly, temporarily, and at decisive moments. The soldiers who carried this out did not charge forward. They waited. They waited for the enemy to choose incorrectly. They waited for absence to do the work of force. They waited knowing that discovery meant annihilation. Their success left no ruins. Only empty ground that had been shelled. Only bridges crossed without resistance. Only casualty lists that were shorter than expected. History prefers explosions. It remembers flags and breakthroughs. It rarely remembers nothing happening, even when nothing happening is the result. The Ghost Army was dissolved after the war. Its methods were classified. Its lessons absorbed quietly, then partially forgotten. But the underlying reality did not disappear. War did not become less physical. It became more interpretive. And that leaves us with a final, unresolved tension. If belief can be engineered. If reaction can be redirected. If reality only matters once it is interpreted. Then the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not the one that destroys the enemy's forces. It is the one that convinces the enemy to destroy the wrong thing.